The Moonies get a bad press, but most of us know nothing about them. Founded in Korea by the Reverend Moon in the 1950s, the Moonies, or Unification Church, now have followers and business interests in Asia, America and Europe. Core members live away from their families in church centres and work full-time for the movement, selling things and looking for new recruits. Seen by believers as a new Messiah, Moon tells his followers, "I am a thinker. I am your brain. When you join, you do everything in utter obedience to me, because what I'm doing is done under God's command." To believers, the movement offers truth, enlightenment, and the prospect of the spiritual unification of the world. To critics, it's an evil form of bondage, where vulnerable young people are reduced to a mental condition where they can only follow the orders of the organisation. But what's the reality behind the headlines? Why do people become Moonies? Do they choose, or are they brainwashed? These and many other questions were investigated by Eileen Barker in a 7-year study of the Moonies. Her book, The Making of a Moonie, is seen as a classic, not only for its contribution to the sociological study of religion, but also for its exemplary research methods. And in The Making of a Moonie, how did this book begin? What were its origins?
Well, it was by mistake, really. I was working on something completely different and I was invited to a conference. And I was quite flattered because there were a lot of Nobel laureates who were invited. And I was invited too, and I went along. Well, first of all, I didn't know that it was Unification Church or the Moonies. This was back in the early 70s and nobody knew very much about them. And then somebody told me, and my husband worked for the BBC and went and got a file, which was fairly small in those days. I mean, it's enormous now. And discovered that there was this weird group where there was a messiah who'd come from Korea that brainwashed people and had a whole lot of money, and the director of public prosecutions was looking into him. And all sorts of terrible things like this. And my husband said, "You can't go now." And I said, "Nothing's going to stop me now." And I just got very curious and interested. And then gradually there was more and more negative publicity about the brainwashing and what have you going on. And I got to know them a bit more, and it seemed a good opportunity to look at one of the things that I think is very central to sociology, which is the relationship between the individual and society, how much control society or a group can have over the individual. And of course brainwashing would be the extreme.
So partly you were studying in their own terms, but also as an example of a wider sociological issue about
Yes.
the group and the individual.
Yes.
Did you go with any preconceived ideas when you started research? Were you very open-minded about this?
Oh, I tried to go in as an objective value-free social scientist, obviously. I went in confused because it seemed to me that some of the Moonies whom I got to know, they invited me to their headquarters and various things after the conference, and I went down to their farm in Wiltshire. And talking to some of them who'd got degrees, and one of whose father I knew, who was a professor at the University of London, whom I already knew. And these people seemed intelligent, nice, ordinary people. Now that was really very curious. How could intelligent, nice, ordinary people believe what seemed to me this complete rubbish? How could they give up good jobs and follow this Messiah? How could they allow the Messiah to choose whom they would marry? What kind of work they would do, how many hours they'd work, what country they'd live in, perhaps even whether they'd live or not. And so it did seem to me quite important to try and investigate this.
So how did you get access? I mean, you've already partly explained that in some personal context. It's very difficult getting access to such a widely criticised group. I mean, how did you go about this?
It was difficult, and it took me nearly 2 years to get access on my own terms. But in the end they decided that, or at least this is what I was told, that I listened, whereas everybody else just judged them without listening. And so my chief of contact said, "We've no idea what you think about us, but at least you'll listen." And the rest of the publicity was so negative that they thought I couldn't be worse than that. So in a sense, the negative publicity was very helpful. But it did take time because I needed to get a complete list of the membership so that I could do a random sample and not just speak to people they wanted me to speak to. And then some Moonies from America came to visit me, and they came to my home, and we were a bit nervous, and they asked me what I was wanting to do and what questions I was going to ask. So I asked them what questions they thought would be helpful for me to ask, and wrote down all those questions. And by the end of that, they seemed to be quite satisfied, not having found out, as indeed at that stage I didn't really know myself what I would ask. My children spent some time looking for the bugs. They were sure they planted around the house after that.
Well, they were getting terrible publicity, and indeed still are to some extent. I mean, were you at all concerned yourself that you might become brainwashed or over-involved? That was never a thought?
No, I've studied lots of groups over the years, and I've often been asked this, but I've always found each of the groups I've studied eminently irresistible. And never felt drawn for 1 minute to joining them. Although I very often like and admire and respect some of the individuals, I make a very strong distinction between them and it, the group, and the leader, the him or the her who's leading it.
Okay, so you're going to investigate and you've got lots of questions in your mind, lots of things you don't know yourself. What about your methodology? How did you actually go about undertaking the study? Can you tell us about that?
Well, there were two things. There's sort of technical methodology, and then there's sort of theoretical methodology, having to think how you would approach it. You've got to get some sort of model. So it isn't just you go into the field and ask questions. You've got to work out how you're going to operationalise your concepts. Now that means so that you can recognise choice in my case, or brainwashing. Now brainwashing is obviously a metaphor. You don't ever take a brain out and wash it with Persil or what have you. So how did I recognise it? And there's a long debate. I've been teaching social and moral philosophy for ages, so I knew that free will and determinism, nobody's ever sorted that out completely. So what I did was have to define choice, and I chose choice in terms so that I could make up the kind of questions that I could ask of the Unification Church, so that the answers would be clear and empirically recognisable. That is, anybody else doing the study would have to agree and come to the same result as me. So that took quite a lot of time thinking that out, and I was actually doing that part of the time while I was doing the more technical methodology. I used quite a few different methods because there were a lot of different levels of questions that I wanted to answer. I wanted to know about the individuals, so for that I used in-depth interviews. These were long interviews that were tape recorded. And then I wanted to find out about the social interaction between the people. And for that I did participant observation, that is, I went and lived with the Moonies and acted as though I were one, though they did know that I wasn't. But after a time they forgot that I wasn't a Moonie and treated me very much like one. That went through various stages. And then the third main method that I used was questionnaire, and this was in order to get more of a balance between the different variables that I wanted to look at. For example, how many people were Catholics and how many people had been Protestants. And then get a bit more complicated. How many people were Catholics who came from immigrant families? How many were male? How many were female? And a whole lot of other things. Long questionnaire, about 42 pages, I think. And that I could play with the answers on the computer. And then also what was very necessary was to have a control group. Because if you're just finding out things about a particular group, and you don't have a control group, that is another group with which you can compare the group that you're studying. You don't know whether what you're finding is because they're a member of that group, or just because they're ordinary human beings, young people. Some things are far more visible because they belong to a cult, or you notice them. So you will see in the newspapers a headline saying, "Cult member commits suicide." Now, it's probably perfectly true that cult members do commit suicide. It is, in fact. But unless you use a control group to see how many, say, Methodists of the same age and background commit suicide, you can't say anything about the movement and its connection with suicide. So it's fairly complicated, but the point I'm trying to make is that I needed to have a control group with which to compare the Moonies.
Did you ever think of doing the observational research covertly?
Well, it was too late in a sense because they knew me, and so I couldn't suddenly say, I'm not doing research. It was obvious that I was. But I think there are a lot of reasons why it's better not to do covert research. I think there are certain situations in which one has to, and there are some classic studies which obviously one couldn't have done locally. But most studies, I think, if you've got the time, then you get far more information. There's the ethical reason that I don't think you should deceive the people that you're studying. There's a psychological reason for the researcher. I've known some people who have really had nervous breakdowns because they've been having to live a lie, and it's been very great pressure on them. There was one student, not one of mine, but of somebody else's, who really did have a breakdown when he was studying another new religious movement because of the pressure, and the psychiatrist said that he couldn't continue with his thesis. But also methodologically, once people get to know you and trust you that you're not going to tell the tabloid newspapers on the one hand or the leaders inside on the other, they start to treat you as what I call a professional stranger. You know how people will tell you things in trains because you're never going to see them again. The professional stranger who's been in a group for a long time, people will come and discuss things, and they will complain about things that they can't complain about to anybody else. And so you get an enormous amount of information because they need to tell somebody. I'm still getting information from people who are both, well, who are still in or who are on the margins, and they want to talk to somebody whom they can trust.
When you're working with a group and you're giving this very rich, detailed information, there are mechanical problems of remembering it all, recording it all, and of course the fact that your ideas will change as the research progresses. I mean, how did you take account of these problems? What did you do about it?
Well, I kept a diary, a very, very strict diary right from the beginning, in which I put not just what I was finding out, the facts, but also my own experiences and what I was thinking. And looking back later at some of these diaries, the things that I thought strange, I no longer thought were strange, or the things that I didn't really notice, I suddenly began later to realise. Now this was very important, not just so that I had a record, but also to remind me what I had to explain to other people. What you've got to do is translate it so that it can be understood. I don't mean approved of or disapproved of, I just mean understood and heard, because people can't always hear things that are strange. So by going back to the diaries and seeing what I hadn't heard in the beginning and what I learned, this was very helpful.
So we talk about participant observation, we use the word so much. For you it's partly becoming immersed in what you're doing, but partly remaining detached and,
yes.
And keeping up with it.
I also went, afterwards I realised there were 3 stages that I went through. The first one was being very passive, and there I would try and find something that I could do which would give me permission to be there, but not make me feel, or anybody else feel, that I had to do too much. For example, washing up dishes, or darning socks, or I wrote out lots of songs on sheets of paper that were held up. I hated doing that, but I could obviously be concentrating on that while listening and not having to come into the conversation, disrupt it and make a difference. And then after a bit, when I'd sort of learnt the language through the book, as it were, through observing, I started to act it and interact and play. And I would be corrected when I made mistakes, which is part of the socialization process. I could see how new recruits, new converts, would learn how to behave in a different way. And during that time, you learn to use the language so that you don't jar, you don't stick out like a sore thumb. Sometimes literally the language, some of the concepts and things they use, but the way you sit, the way you dress yourself, the way you cut your hair, the way you eat or you wait, or all sorts of other things you have to learn. Third stage was when I stopped doing that, but was far more aggressive, and I would ask questions which I had dared ask in the beginning, the sorts of questions that perhaps an investigative journalist might ask. what about the money? How can you do this? What about such and such in the theology? That doesn't make sense. That goes against that. What about this corruption or whatever? If I'd done that at the beginning, they'd said you can't understand. But by this time, it was clear that I did understand and did speak their language.
Right, so we talked about the different methods that you've used. I mean, you've did long, detailed interviews, you've observed movies in a variety of settings, and you've sent questionnaires both to them and to the control group. A term students often use is triangulation, looking at the same problem. Would that aptly describe your approach? Would it not be a label you'd want to hit on?
Triangulation. As you can use that, I mean, that's 3 different groups, 3 different approaches. I think it's important to have these because if you just look at the individual, you miss the social processes. And if you just look at the social processes, you don't know what's going on in the individual. And if you don't have the questionnaire, the whole lot, or at least a random sample, and the control group, you can't know what's specific and, sort of be more quantitative. And I think if you just take one or other, you only get a distorted vision of what is going on.
So how did Eileen Barker explain the making of a Moonie? If potential recruits were going to be brainwashed, it was going to happen here, at the Moonie workshops.
Now, these were the workshops which everybody said, if you go to them, you get brainwashed, and once you're on the sort of sausage machine line, you come out a Moonie.
Right.
And what I actually found was that the vast majority of them didn't come out a Moonie. So you couldn't just look at the social context and the pressure that was being put on them at that time to explain the outcome, because the outcome included what the people at the workshop, the Moonies, were not trying to get. So that was sort of fairly fundamental refutation of the main hypothesis that it's just the Moonies and the group which could control the individual. But there were a whole lot of other questions you had to ask after that. Who would join and why would they join?
Maybe the Moonies' tactics only worked on those who were especially vulnerable. Answering this question involved a controlled study.
And in fact, I had 2 control groups. One that had absolutely nothing to do with the Unification Church, but were the same age and background and matched by as many things as I already knew about the Unification Church as possible, social class background, etc., educational background. And then I had a group of people who went to the workshop and didn't join, and then there was the group of the Moonies. And one of my hypotheses was that the people who went to the workshop and became Moonies would be particularly suggestible or feeble, something in some way, so that the, quote, brainwashing processes could work on them better. And then the people who went to the workshop were slightly more suggestible because they'd at least agreed to go to these residential workshops. Whereas the normal, by definition, people would be those who got nothing to do with movement. What I actually found was that it was a subgroup of those who went to the workshop and didn't join, who were the ones who would, by a whole lot of independent criteria, be particularly vulnerable, it would seem. They'd had unhappy backgrounds, they'd done badly at school, they'd have suicide attempts, things like that. And the ones who actually became unificationists were more normal. So that refuted the weaker hypothesis that it was the more suggestible and vulnerable people who were likely to become unificationists.
And we've rejected 2 explanations. One, that the Moonies are brainwashed, and secondly, they just consist of a group of social adequates who are very vulnerable to suggestion. So why do people become Moonies?
Well, the first thing to say is that not everybody joins for the same reasons. People join for different reasons. But I did find that there were certain kind of bundles of predispositions, things that people were either looking for, positively seeking, or could be made to think they wanted. There are some people who just never, ever want to be a Moonie, and I'm one of them. There are some people who join practically everything. But usually those people will join for a short time and then move on, rather than stay. But what I found was that the people who did, they tended to be, well, demographically young, about 23 was the average age, male slightly more than female. They came from middle or upper middle class, disproportionately, there were working classes, but disproportionately good homes by a whole lot of different criteria, well educated, perhaps not the absolute top, perhaps not emotionally as advanced or as streetwise as some people. But I found an interesting thing when I was asking parents' occupations. Very few people from backgrounds where the parents had been involved in making money became Moonies, whereas far more came from the more professional middle classes, particularly, disproportionately, from those where there was a kind of value of service and people thinking that they had to contribute. And that was quite interesting because very often people think that they joined as a rejection of the family values, but it seemed as though it was more because of the family values. They wanted to be of service, and I think very often people think young people just want to take. I think that's wrong. I think there's a certain number, quite a large number, who want to give. And what a unification church gave them was the opportunity to sacrifice. Now, this is seen as exploitation, and perhaps it is exploitation from one point of view, but from another point of view, it's an opportunity to be of use to try and make the world a better place. Another scenario is before they had left home, they found their parents were too good in a way, they were too concerned to control their lives, and they felt smothered, and it wasn't really what they wanted to do. And so they would move somewhere else where they were still within a womb-like situation, but away from their parents. And what they found, and other people have found as well, is that after perhaps a couple of years, they would have renegotiated their relationship with their parents so that they were on a more equal level and they could come out and lead the kind of lives that they wanted. So it was a kind of period of growth.
So why do people leave?
Now, quite often, they discovered after they'd been in for a bit that they weren't getting what they want. And just to add to the questioning the brainwashing hypothesis or thought control or mind control hypothesis, the majority of people who were joining were leaving of their own free will within a couple of years. So even when they were in the movement and having all the pressures which the movement undoubtedly put on them, I mean, they wanted them to stay, yet they could still say, thanks very much, I'm leaving after a short time.
So the book was published 15 years ago now. Why do you think it's still relevant? Why do you think it's still quoted in all the sociology textbooks?
Well, you have to ask the people who read it, of course, but what I'm told is that methodologically people seem to find it useful. But I think in a wider field, the question of mind control, brainwashing, that something is done to people, is still very much out there. Not among sociologists, but it was the first book that, in a sense, tried to present the question in such a way that it's really very difficult to say it must be that they have some strange techniques which are irresistible and irreversible, because patently this is not the case. And so it was perhaps one of the first ones that, as far as new religious movements are concerned, tried to look at why people would join without just saying, well, they must have chosen or they must have been brainwashed. So I think that it's still relevant from that point of view.
So have there been any sort of practical outcomes from your research into new religions?
Yes, quite a few, but I think probably the most obvious was the setting up of Inform, information network focused on religious movements. And this was because by the 1980s, the late 1980s, where I was studying a vast number of religions and people associated with them, I saw what seemed to me a lot of unnecessary suffering through either lack of information or misinformation. The misinformation might come from the movements themselves, saying how wonderful they were, or from the media and the anti-cultists generalising, saying how they were brainwashing and so on, and exploitative.
When Eileen Barker was researching for her book Making of a Moonie, throughout her participant observation,